So tonight, you're going to be hearing from myself, Nicole Mace. I'm the Associate Director for Legal Services at the VSBA. And I'm also this year responsible for coordinating legislative collaborative and writing the education legislative report that comes out on behalf, sponsored or published by historically, it's been the VSBA, the VSA, Superintendents Association, and the Principals Association. This year we have 3 additional participating organizations, the Association of School Business Officers, the Council of Special Education Administrators, and BizBit. So we are fortunate in that we have the support of all those organizations, and I've got my eye tuned to all matters public policy over the next 4 months, and we'll be, as I said, in charge of writing that report. So this topic tonight is very much within my bailiwick, so to speak. And I'm joined by Steve Dale, who's our Executive Director. I don't know, Steve, if you want to say hi or.
Sure. I'll just say hi so you can hear my voice. I'll be picking up the mic at some point during the presentation.
We're trying this for the first time. Steve and I are in different locations, so there may be some technical maneuvering as we advance in the presentation, but hopefully Carrie's got it all under control, so it'll be smooth sailing. So that's who you're going to hear from tonight. What we're going to talk about are the following. First, I'm just going to go over what do we mean when we say public education policy. What is it we're talking about generally, and specifically what most of the conversation is going to be related to the legislative session. What's the role of board members in this area? What does the legislative process look like? What are VSBA's legislative priorities? Steve's going to spend a good chunk of time tonight going through those. And what supports are available for board members that have an interest in public policy and advocacy through the VSBA. So we inhabit a complex system with many moving parts, as you all know. We just came from a day-long symposium on education policy, I believe, at UVM, hosted by Shap Smith and the president of UVM, dedicated to both understanding all the relevant moving parts in public education, but also the different policy approaches that might be employed to accomplish a vision for moving Vermont's schools into the 21st century. And I'll speak a little bit more about that, and Steve, I suspect, might hint on it. But what emerged from the conversation today was that we indeed inhabit a complex system. And on the policy front, there are 4 major drivers in the field of education. And the first is the legislative body, so the General Assembly and the State Board of Education. And these bodies are responsible for passing laws in the sense of the General Assembly, and in the State Board realm, adopting rules. So I think laws are fairly self-evident. We have our green book, the Education Law Book, which we publish, the VSBA publishes annually, and includes Title 16, which is the title in Vermont statutes that relates specifically to education. But it also includes other relevant provisions of law that touch upon education or have an impact on education outside of Title 16. Sometimes less apparent than the statutes themselves are the rules promulgated by the state board and other administrative bodies which follow the procedures outlined in the Administrative Procedures Act. So the state board rules cover things like education quality standards, pre-K program approval procedures, vocational technical education. There's a pretty restraint and seclusion, and they have the force and effect of law, but aren't always thought of immediately when thinking about what are the sort of legal constraints affecting school districts. So there's a manual of rules and practices that can be found online on the State Board of Education website. And so for those of you who are interested in that particular body, particularly I think the Education Quality Standards was pretty active this year. It's a very it is an evolving body of law or regulation affecting schools. The second sort of layer in terms of the policy landscape are the courts or the judiciary system. So they're charged with evaluating, interpreting, and applying laws and regulations passed by our legislative bodies to specific cases. So in some instances, you have a court opinion that can have a significant impact on education policy. And probably the biggest one that comes to mind in Vermont is the Brigham decision, which struck down our prior education funding system as unconstitutional. So cases like Brigham and even others that are not quite as significant in terms of their scope and impact develop a body of case law that gives guidance both to the legislature in terms of what constitutional parameters they might be operating in when they pass laws, but also to folks in the field who need to interpret how a given law might be applied in a specific context. So that's the judicial layer on public policy. Then we have the executive branch, so the governor and now the Secretary of Education, whose role is to issue number one, the governor, as we saw particularly last year in his State of the State address that he devoted entirely to education, the governor really has the ability to set general direction and vision for education policy, and the Agency of Education has the responsibility for issuing regulatory guidance with respect to how districts might comply with some specific laws or regulations, and providing enforcement and support to folks on the ground who are tasked with implementing a particular policy. For example, the personal learning plans law that was passed in the last session as part of Act 77. There's a working group that's been established working with the Agency of Education and folks in the field to develop guidance and models for folks to use as they move towards full implementation of that law. Last layer in the public policy landscape are school boards, whose responsibility is to establish local policy and also to ensure that their administrators, that they're hiring administrators who are ensuring that the system is in compliance with all the state and federal laws, which I didn't get into in terms of federal policy. But school boards play a role definitely in defining local policy parameters and ensuring that those parameters are in fact being followed. So the focus today is generally going to be on the legislature and the executive branch and those players in the process. And with respect to the executive branch, effective January 1 of last year, the governor now has more direct control over the now Agency of Education, and his new Secretary of Education, Rebecca Holcomb, who's pictured here, just started on the job January 2nd, and that's a result of Act 98, which moved the Department of Education, made that an Agency of Education, and the Commissioner of Education, which used to be appointed by the State Board of Education, is now a member of the governor's cabinet and is selected by the governor based on candidates submitted to him from the State Board of Ed. So the State Board still, under Act 98, still retains policymaking authority, which it exercised in earnest over the last year through its update of the school quality standards, which are now going to be known as the education quality standards. So we're going to be watching closely to see how this new model for education leadership plays out. It's still in its infancy. and I think the changing roles and responsibilities are being worked out. But so far, it seems to be, Rebecca certainly is making a smooth transition into the role. So when it comes to shaping education policy, school board members have an important role to play. Number one, you're the locally elected representatives for education in your communities. And so in terms of being able to communicate effectively with your locally elected representatives in the legislature, it's a role that you both, I think, understand, and you can be effective advocates for understanding, helping each other understand the landscape both at the state level and at the local level. Board members, by definition, are passionate about education. Steve says this all the time. Why else would you dedicate so much of your time to meetings and in a often thankless environment, particularly maybe this time of year, if you weren't passionate about ensuring our students are getting an excellent education and taxpayers are getting an excellent return on their investment. Board members are also knowledgeable on the issues and understand how policy and implementation intersect in a very real way. So that's what I mean in terms of being able to communicate to your legislators about how whatever law that they passed affects your community and the extent to which your systems are able to implement those policies. It's important information for them to have. And board members have the benefit of being informed by updates from the VSBA. So we do, as I think we're going to talk about a little bit later, but we have legislative updates or alerts that you can expect to see sent to you by email throughout the session. If there's a particular issue that's coming up that we really need folks to be communicating with their representatives about, you'll have information in a timely way about that, in addition to the education legislative report, which we issue with our collaborative every 5 to 7 days. So you'll have both substance in terms of understanding what the major bills are through our education reports, but also a sense of timing when you get our legislative alerts in terms of now's the time to to communicate. Speak now or forever hold your peace kind of thing. So I'm going to spend the next, oh, no, now we have a poll. Carrie, can you get the poll going? So we want to know over the past couple of years how often or has your board spent time discussing public policy issues? So Carrie's going to launch that poll for us.
The poll's open. We have 90% that's answered. Anyone else want to answer?
So we can't see the I can't see the results.
Just 1 second. When save all answered.
Okay.
Oops. There you go.
I can't, because they're seeing my screen.
Oh, I'm sorry. Nicole, 91% of them said yes, 9% said no.
Great. Thanks, Carrie. That was one of the technical glitches I was referring to. Normally we're all in the same room together, so that we can all see the poll results. So thanks for responding. So a good chunk, almost, uniformly, you're all discussing public policy issues at your board meetings. So that's good because as I said earlier, we just came from a symposium at UVM on how education needs to change to better reflect the needs of today's students and our society. Legislators are very engaged in this conversation, whether it's from an education policy in terms of what, a lot of the activity last year around flexible pathways, dual enrollment, the pre-K bill, that they're, those types of issues, whether it's on the the fiscal side in terms of attention being paid to how much money we're spending in education and what results we're seeing, legislators are very engaged, and so it's critical that board members be engaged as well. So we're really happy that you're joining us tonight. Just by way of making sure we're all on the same page in terms of the process, I'm going to spend a few slides going over the process by which a bill becomes a law in Vermont. So the first thing that happens is a bill is introduced in the House or the Senate or both. And for the purposes of this exercise, we're going to assume it's been introduced on the House side. It's then assigned to a House committee, and what happens is they put that bill on a wall with the bill number and the title of the bill. And then the chair of a committee, really, it's his or her prerogative to decide which bills are taken up and which bills stay on the wall. If the committee decides to take it up, then they'll hear testimony. They will debate among themselves, and then they'll take a vote. If the policy or bill involves other committees, the money committees being ones that typically get involved, those committees will weigh in and review the bill. Once everyone's approved in terms of the relevant committees, they'll refer it to the full House, where they will take action on the floor. They'll debate the bill on the floor. If it passes, then it will move to the other body. So now we're on the Senate side. The process will repeat itself in terms of assignment to a Senate committee, which will take testimony, vote, refer to other involved committees. Then the final committee involved will refer it to the full Senate, will be debated on the floor, and they'll take a vote. If the second version varies, so if the version passed by the Senate has been amended in any way, there will likely be a conference committee to work out the differences. Sometimes they won't go to conference if the differences are minor, and the other body will just agree to the changes. But if there are significant differences, a conference committee will be put together with representatives from the House side and the Senate side to work out any differences. And then there will be votes on the changed or final version by both bodies. If it passes both bodies, then it'll move to the governor, and the governor can either veto or sign the bill, and if he does sign it, then the bill becomes law. So that's a very quick overview of how a bill becomes law. And I know there's some really fun animated video out there that we could use, but instead you have this. So the 2014 legislative session kicked off last Tuesday on January 7th. The governor delivered his State of the State on Thursday, was it? Or Wednesday or Thursday, which he devoted entirely to opiate addiction. But this week, the activity continued. We had a legislative symposium today. There is a symposium on education finance to be scheduled, that's to be held tomorrow at St. Michael's College. Again, legislators, representatives from the governor's office, we're going to be there to examine our education funding system. And governor's budget address is on Wednesday. So we're going to start to see some ideas emerge, some focus, some direction over the course of the next couple of weeks. I'll just say a few things about leadership. So on the House side, the Speaker of the House is still Shap Smith. The Chair of the House Education Committee is Joey Donovan. She's been in that role for a little while now. And the Chair of House Ways and Means is Representative Janet Ansel. On the Senate side, the President Pro Tem is John Campbell. The Chair of Senate Education is Dick McCormick. And the Chair of Senate Finance is Tim Ash. So all committees have been really hit the ground running. This is the second year of the biennium, so they're really hoping to adjourn early in May. And there hasn't been a dull moment yet. So with that, I'll turn it over to Steve to go through the VSBA legislative priorities.
Thank you, Nicole. And thanks to all of you for joining us for this event. I wanted to remind you while we're shifting the control of this affair from Nicole to me. All right, let's see if this does it. Okay, well, while we're doing that, I wanted to remind you that you can raise your hand if you would like to comment as we go. You can also use the question box to make comments. There we go. Okay. You can use the question box to either ask questions, make comments, and I expect there will be more interest in doing that now that we're moving more into the current issues part of this discussion. We try to have these be as informal as possible, although it's not exactly the most flexible medium that's out there, but it is possible to have some good back and forth, and we think it's important that we hear from you as well as you hearing from us as we go forward. So I'm going to talk about three major areas from the standpoint of how the VSBA is viewing this legislative session. The first has to do with what I would call, in summation, moving education forward. It's really focusing on the large agenda that we put forward last year to try to continue to improve education in Vermont and move us dramatically forward in some ways that I'm going to describe. The second major area, is education costs and property taxes. In case you hadn't noticed, there's considerable interest in those subjects. Every day there is interest in those subjects. I'm very anxious to see what this forum does tomorrow in terms of raising new ideas and new issues, but it's one that I know has already affected many school boards trying to figure out how it is that when you have a 3% increase in your budget, your taxpayers are looking at a 9% increase or a 20% increase. We have some serious issues this year, and so we will need to be immersing ourselves collectively in that area. And then there's a category that I'm going to call miscellaneous that are issues that have come to our attention that our membership has taken action on, and I will just mention those and we can talk about them in more detail if folks on the line would like to do that. So I'm going to move on to the first major theme. A year ago, we and the Vermont Superintendents Association created a joint agenda for a world-class education system. We sent a copy of it to every board member at that time. You know, just to make sure that we've got everybody awake out there, I'm going to ask for a quick show of hands. How many people were on your board in February of last year? So if you could raise your hand if you were on your board in February of last year, that would just give us a read on. We have an experienced group here. Okay, it looks like all but maybe 3 or so. I think we've got 11 people on the line here. So yeah, all but 2 or 3 of you were here last year. So hopefully this is not news to you, what I'm sharing. The joint agenda became the focal point of our efforts in the legislature last year and has guided much of our work during the year. It was the focal point of our annual conference at Lake Maury this year. Hopefully some of you had the opportunity to participate in that and to immerse yourself in what personalized and proficiency-focused education looks like. We strongly suggest that board members engage with this work locally and seek to be catalysts for moving it forward in your regions. And I'm only going to touch on this evening because this continues to be the part of the underpinning of what drives us when we get into the public policy arena. assuming that I can keep going here, let's see. Carry my, it's not moving to the next slide. Okay, I guess I'm here now. Okay, so the 5 pillars of the joint agenda, I'm going to run through them very quickly because this is really not the time for an in-depth presentation, but I mention them because when I talk to you about the things that are going on in the legislature right now, there are several areas where there is a direct connection. So the first pillar was assuring success for every child, and there were 2 major areas that received a lot of legislative discussion last year, and much of it is continuing. The first is universal access to pre-K. That continues to be a major priority. Currently, the bill, which is H-270, made it all the way through the House last year and made it through several Senate committees. It is now sitting in the Senate Appropriations Committee. It is being the primary reason why the VSBA supported pre-K, which I will be coming back to in a couple minutes, is that we have 85% of our districts already offering some level of pre-K support. And at this point, it does reach a threshold where it becomes an equity issue. If we believe, and there is lots of reason to believe it, lots of evidence, that it has a significant impact on lifelong learning, we must assure that all children have access. Our membership voted, I believe, unanimously at our annual meeting to support the Universal Access Bill. It is very unusual for the VSBA to support a measure that could qualify as an unfunded mandate, but in this instance, it felt so fundamental to our ability to put kids on the right path for a fairly modest cost that it seemed like one that we ought to go out on a limb and say, absolutely, we should have universal access. It's not okay for kids in 15 districts to not have access when most students will have the access. The amount of increased budget pressure will be modest over the next 5 years. We've heard various estimates. Because of the way this is all structured, and if you do provide pre-K, you are able to count those students in your count. Individual districts may actually see improvement in their tax rates as a result of creating pre-K. As a state, it could result in an additional $5 million or so over and above what would happen without the bill over the next 5 years. So it's, I mean, it's real money, but obviously compared to the $1.5 billion education fund, the return on that investment is really, I think, pretty unmistakable. The second major area under the 5 pillars was promoting personalized learning, proficiency focus, and a wide range of new opportunities to engage students. If the goal here is to engage every student, then we have to have a much more varied approach to engaging all students. And last year we strongly supported what became Act 77, which both calls for personalized learning plans and creates a variety of flexible pathways for students. The second major pillar of our joint agenda was called a focus on a new vision for teaching and learning. It focuses on the evolving role of the teacher from being largely a source of information now to a coach and a mentor who's facilitating the creation of a learning environment, facilitating learning for students. Secondly, focusing on the critical role of the principal, and finally, looking at collective bargaining, needing to be sure that our collective bargaining agreements support this new vision for teaching and learning. Obviously, a huge issue. I have to say that there has not been significant interest in the last bullet point in the legislature, but I do believe that over the course of the next year or two, it is likely to be an area of significant discussion, simply because I think most teachers are anxious to move into this new world, and we do have a number of collective bargaining agreements in the state that become huge barriers to preventing the kind of changes that we're talking about. The third agenda is engaging and supporting families and communities on the belief that obviously engaged families have everything to do with student success. Delivering and using world-class technology, assuring the availability of technology, connectivity, hardware, software, but probably more importantly, promoting the transformation of learning that can occur when you do have high-quality technology. And obviously, this is a big issue in the legislature because many of our schools, many school boards have taken on this issue and said, we have to do this to transform learning in this century. But there are a number of schools that do not have the level of technological supports that they need, and that is an issue that ultimately I think there needs to be some support from on the state level. And last but not least, moving education forward in Vermont will require focused leadership at the board, superintendent, and principal level. Last year, a requirement was added that superintendents and board chairs receive joint training annually. Excuse me. But this area requires more attention, and I'm going to discuss that more in a second. So when we talk about this year's legislative session, what are the main messages around this agenda? The first one is that this is a year for implementation. If you go back over the last 15 years, you will see that every year the legislature is in session, they pass multiple bills that ask schools to do new things. Most of them are good things. Most of them we would probably agree with. But we are urging the legislature this year to by and large, see this as an implementation year. We have implemented, or I'm sorry, we've created law that will establish flexible pathways, personal learning plans. There have been a number of increases and improvements in technology, many changes in local programs and practices, and it is really important that we engage in this activity on a local basis and turn down a little bit of the heat on continued public policy changes that simply require local boards to react, change. We want to stay this course for a period of time. So that's a major message that we've taken to the legislature. That doesn't mean we'll be successful in stopping all activity, nor should we. But it's an important message. The second is pass the pre-K legislation. It is expected that the Senate will pass the bill sometime in the next month. And the governor has already stated in his State of the State message last week that he would sign it. Assure equal access to technology. We've urged the education committees to ask the Agency of Education to provide an analysis of what the state of the state is relative to technology so that they can determine what action on a state level may be needed, whether it's some kind of a fund to help school districts finance technology improvements if they haven't been able to get it in their budgets, whatever it may be. There needs to be a full understanding of where we are. And last but not least is this whole issue around educational leadership, addressing it in a logical way. And I'm going to take a couple minutes to talk. Let's see. I see there's a question. I don't know if that got answered or not. It's all taken care of? Okay. We have a challenge, a leadership challenge at the moment. And I'm going to call it a leadership and governance challenge. We need to assure equal educational opportunity for every child. And when we talk about the agenda that I just ran out, it really does require that we expand opportunities, that we be able to use to have much greater flexibility in how we structure the learning process. And we can't be in a position where what we're doing is constantly looking to how do we decrease offerings because we're in a money squeeze. We have to get to a place where we can think creatively and flexibly and provide these offerings within a reasonable cost structure. So our first challenge is the need to assure equal education opportunity. The second leadership challenge, governance challenge, is the need to be able to respond to cost drivers in a very tight fiscal environment. I think this year we are likely to be in a pinch that we haven't been in a great many years. I think the legislature is likely to take actions that will potentially compromise smaller districts that have less flexibility and higher spending districts. In light of the large property tax increases, I fear that school budgets could be in substantial trouble. I know from talking with many board members and from reading the paper that boards have been agonizing over their budgets, and many have come in with very reasonable budget increases. However, those reasonable budget increases are translating into very high property taxes because of the structure of the system. And that system is going to be looked at both in terms of its own structure, but also there continues to be concern about spending levels. We need to help divide. There are a number of people in the legislature who periodically throw out quick fixes. If we only did X, Y, or Z, we could save all kinds of money. And you know, sometimes that translates into if we only had 16 supervisory unions, we could save tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. Those kinds of comments. So there are significant financial pressures that I think we need to be able to respond to. Thirdly, we have a significant challenge in attracting and retaining strong leaders. We have a serious leadership turnover among our superintendents and principals. Currently, there are 12 superintendent searches going on out of 62. The pool of candidates is quite shallow, and it is especially so in complex districts. And in many areas, we have a very unattractive structure for people whose primary driver is to make a difference for children. I'm looking at who's on this webinar. There's a couple folks that have very challenging environments, but we have some districts where you have 12 or 13 school boards where superintendents spend all of their time, most of their time, preparing, attending, and following up board meetings, and are able to devote very little time to teaching and learning and improving education. In the board arena, we have a number of board folks who have expressed to me concern about whether they have enough time to focus on the bigger picture issues of where is education going and are we effective at getting there, because there are so many details that people have to pay attention to. So there are some, I think, significant leadership challenges that we face. The fourth challenge is the built-in complexity and lack of accountability in supervisory unions. Supervisory unions were created in 1912 as a teacher supervision mechanism, and over 100 years they morphed into something that you might call more like system management. However, I don't have to tell most of you, I'm looking at where you're all from, most of you are from supervisory unions. It's very difficult to think of it as an effective, and I'm not talking about some individual SUs that have figured it out quite well, but as a structure, it's not terribly accountable. Superintendents work for multiple bosses. It is, in some places, very difficult for a board to set a single direction and then see it through to conclusion. The SU system, I get complaints constantly about the fact that as we have centralized more functions at the supervisory union level, those budgets are now becoming a large insert into district budgets, and local voters are complaining that they don't have a chance to weigh in specifically on those budgets. That is becoming an increasing problem, and there are legislators who say we got to do something about that. I could go on, but there are significant challenges in the supervisory union structure, and it's probably evidenced best when we know that we have supervisory unions that have 2 districts, and we have some that have 13 districts. We have legislators who are saying, well, why don't we go down to 16? Why don't we go to 17? Why don't we go to 30? Those proposals are all in play as we speak. So my point on raising all of this is that there they are, there's the proposals. The current messages from legislative leaders are they think that we need to do something about our overall governance structure so that we can be more nimble, so that we can make sure that we're providing more opportunities for kids within a reasonable cost structure with sufficient numbers of students and size budgets so that people aren't in constant crisis when 2 or 3 special needs students move into their district or 5 students move away from their district, leaving that in a way that it can actually affect, negatively affect their tax rate. So there are a number of people saying something needs to happen here in the world that we live in that really is certainly state, national, and global in focus rather than constrained to the boundaries of a particular community. So one of the challenges that would put out there is that Vermont school boards need to provide leadership in defining a pathway ahead on this issue, which has lingered for 50 years. I don't know what that pathway looks like. Whoops, let me go back here. I don't know exactly what that pathway looks like, but I'm very concerned that there is a lot of discussion in the legislature about it. And almost everywhere you turn, there's people with ideas, and I think we need to put forward ideas that could be effective in achieving the objectives that I just ran out. I would welcome those of you that are on the line here, if you've got any ideas about that, if you've got any thoughts about it, things that you've been thinking about as you've gone through your board service. We are anxious to hear from our membership, and we will be putting out more broad-based requests for ideas. So at this point, I'm going to stop here because this is the first major category. I'm going to talk about the money and a couple of other things in a minute, but I would like to see what comments or questions you have about any of these areas relative to moving education forward in a broad way. You can either do that, let's see, you can either do that by raising your hand, and Carrie can call on you and you can talk to us, assuming you have a microphone, or you could enter a question or a comment in the box. Okay, seeing.
I see Shad Muraller had a comment.
Does she have her hand up?
She had a comment in the question box.
Okay, I'm not seeing it here.
It says, why not 62 supervisory districts? Oh,
huh, I don't see it in. I don't see it
Jerome
in the
Shed just said, if boards are to move education forward and maintain their proper role, VSBA could help by providing model policies.
Okay. Oh, I see. I am seeing these things now. Okay.
And Joseph Spinella said, what is happening at the university level to improve leadership training?
All right. So, okay, there we go. All right. My little question box was not stretched the way it should be. Okay, I'm starting to see everything here. Got it. All right. So let me go to a couple of these. Okay, model policies. We have a number of model policies, and so I'm not sure. I'm talking to Jerome now. And so actually, Jerome, what might make the most sense would be for you to send an email to us explaining what exactly you mean. We have model policies online. Nicole, who's obviously been speaking with you this evening, is responsible for that section of the work that we do, and we would welcome a conversation with you to talk in more details about that. Then I see Jonathan makes a comment about the inherent tension between the potential cost value of consolidating versus the Vermont way. As many of you know, I served on a school board for a number of years. I absolutely believe in the full connection of communities and the fact that we are far better off as a state to have people who are totally invested in education. I think the dilemma that we have is that as you look at what we're trying to accomplish for students, and you start to look at the decisions that individual boards have to make, and as this financial situation becomes tighter, and thus far, of course, up to this year, we've had 95% of our budgets approved the first time around. However, Walden recently had its budget defeated 5 times, and I am very concerned about the level of tax increases that people are looking at in their communities. So the concern is that if preserving exactly what we've got right now results in scaled back programming for countless Vermont children, it may be time to say, is there a way to maintain the Vermont way, if you will, and be in a environment where we can exercise more flexibility to create more opportunities for our kids. So that's the dilemma, Jonathan, and I don't know the answer to it, but it's one that I think it would be good for school boards to engage with in a way that takes an activistic role rather than a reactive role, which I fear we could find ourselves in the further down the road we go.
Steve?
Looking at Sean Marie.
Oh, I was going to say, go right ahead.
I'm sorry, Carrie, is there somebody with a hand? Or?
No, I was just going to let you know that Sean Marie also had a comment, as well as Joseph Spinella.
Okay, I've got him here, yep. Sean Marie, you're right. Obviously, I mean, ultimately, we are far better off if these problems could get addressed by local folks figuring it out, no question about it. Somebody does it in Montpelier. The governor has said this repeatedly. You want to see a mess, give it to somebody in Montpelier to redraw lines or some such thing. Let's see. Okay, I guess all this stuff about unmuted, is that getting
And you
straightened
have,
out?
you have Joseph Spinella said, what is happening at the university level to improve leadership training?
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying. You can't see the questions that I can see. All right, thank you, Jill. The question was, what is happening at the university level to improve leadership training? That's a very good question. The only thing that I would tell you that I'm very aware of that's happened this year is that the Superintendent's Association has organized an excellent, will that do it? Yeah. Okay. All right, okay. I don't know if people can see them now. Hopefully you can. So what they've done is set up a program for prospective superintendent candidates, prospective educational leaders. And it's, I think, an excellent program that's been going on all year, a couple days a month, I think, for most of the year. And the hope is that we'll begin to build a stronger pool internally. Obviously, our challenge is that even as we get people trained, are the jobs structured in a way that that we're going to be able to attract folks, the best folks, into those positions? That becomes our big question. And the last question, I think, comment that was here was, I see, don't do that. Okay. Why not 62 supervisory districts? That's one idea that's on the table, but I think there are, when you look at the state of Vermont, supervisory unions were not necessarily drawn by people who knew the culture and history of Vermont, and I think there would be a lot of people that would say, don't just change the structure of supervisory unions. But certainly that's an idea that's been on the table. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next whole area, which is, okay, let's see. Carrie, I'm not getting to my next section, which has to do with assuring a reasonable approach to education costs and property taxes. Okay, we'll see where this is. Okay. We have had a general approach as an association to this issue because this is obviously very hot at the moment, and I'm going to give you the quick overview and then I'll give you some background. The first is to monitor the financial situation. I'm going to present you some information about the facts about what's happened financially, because to read the paper or to listen to politicians, you get a certain kind of image, and it's not always entirely true. And then as we have tried to say, we as the local school boards in the state of Vermont certainly are as concerned as anybody about the financial challenges, and we would like to work with policymakers to try to find solutions. This last year, I'm going to say a couple things about this one before I come back to the some of the overall facts about finances. There were various proposals put forward, and we shared that our membership is split on a number of them. One was to eliminate small schools grants. There are about 35% of our members that receive small schools grants, and that was part of the original Act 60 deal that said we value small schools. We understand it costs a little more to run a small school, and we, in essence, subsidize the functioning of small schools. There were people who wanted to get rid of the small schools grants, and obviously we have members that are on both sides of that issue. I expect that will come back up again. There's this whole issue of ADM protections for lost students. In other words, there is a protection that if you were to lose 10% of your student body this year, there's a floor. You can count kids. I think you're protected to a maximum loss of 3 or 3.5% in a particular year. So there's that whole issue, and there are people who are on both sides of that issue, whether that's good public policy. So we have tried to say, look, don't do, keep in mind the original deals that were made in Act 60, and don't take multiple steps that would affect small schools in a way that would really force them to not be able to function. But those are issues that are floating around out there, and we should just be aware of those kinds of things. The ones that we have thought were more reasonable had to do with the overall excess spending cap. The excess spending cap used to be that if you spent more than 125% of the average from the previous year, then your taxpayers were heavily penalized for everything you spent above that level. That number was reduced to last year to 123%. Next year or the year after, it drops down to 121. That idea will continue to be floated out there in terms of whether that should be further reduced. We have said that school boards would prefer a big picture approach to cost controls rather than a micromanaging approach. And there were many proposals put forward that were in the category of dictating to boards and to schools what they needed to do to control their spending. The second major general approach we've had is protecting the education fund. There's all kinds of people that would like to use it for all kinds of things, and they do, but part of our general approach is protecting it for K-12 education or pre-K-12 education. Thirdly, seek restoration of the percentage split, and I'm going to show you a graph in a second. The property tax has been taking on an increasingly large role in education spending, and that is a serious problem. And one of our objectives is to restore the split that we had at the beginning, and I'll show you what that looks like. Restore the availability of capital funding. One of the reasons why many school boards have had struggles is because we no longer get state assistance for capital improvements, and that then goes straight into school district budgets. And the last is protect against unfunded mandates. We have many, many requirements on schools. They get added to all the time, and some of them are very worthwhile and reasonable things, but they do add to the cost, and we don't like to hear people then complaining about the cost after they pass a law and our local districts faithfully implement. So I want to go back to that couple of data points. You'll hear people say, well, education spending is out of control. A fact is that over the last 6 years, on a statewide basis, the average increase in costs has been 2.2% on average, and that includes the projected increase of 3.8% this year. So obviously the amount of spending has been very reasonable, and there are people who would say that our education spending level is very sustainable overall. The dilemma is this. Because the number of students has continued to fall, and in the last, we lose about 1% of our students each year. We have been. So the number of students has gone down about 6% over that period of time, and the costs have increased, as you can see. If it's 2.2% per year, you've got a sense of what the increases have looked like over that time. This graph is the primary driver for the legislature in expressing grave concern about our spending levels. The light blue box is per pupil spending levels in 2002, and the dark blue box is the same per pupil spending level in FY12. And what you can see is that in 2002, Vermont's per pupil spending rate was slightly higher, was somewhat higher than the United States average, but it was somewhere in the middle, upper middle of the pack in New England. And what has happened in the intervening 10 years is that our costs have increased quite dramatically, and we are now by far the highest per pupil spending in New England, considerably higher than the United States average, and I think we're right up there, pretty much even with New York and New Jersey are the other two states that are in the $18,000 category, although I think we may well be the highest. This tends to be what drives legislative attention on the situation. So as you think about your budgets and as we talk in the legislature about these issues, this is what we're talking about. That costs, the 2.2%, although it's very modest, the cost per student has gone up significantly faster than that. And it's largely been because of health care, which was 10% last year, rates of 4.5% this year, and the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. I'm sure many of you have done the modeling that VSBIT has offered, which has pushed school district budgets by another 5 to 7% in the healthcare arena. So obviously that's going to push up costs in a fashion that, whereas you might have thought you would have saved money because of decreases in student count, healthcare has been pushing up, as have state and federal policy and mandates. Sequestration cut a considerable amount of money from programs that support low-income students, and each school district had to make a decision about whether to absorb those cuts with shifting it to local budgets or whether to let those programs go. The Common Core, although it doesn't get spoken much about, has a substantial cost associated in terms of professional development, technology, testing, etc. There have been multiple requirements in recent years for bullying, concussions, sexual abuse, seclusion and restraint, green cleaning. We've got a laundry list of items that have been new requirements, and again, most of them are good things, and most of them I think people would say are reasonable social policy, but they do cost money and do prevent some of the savings you might expect to see by declining student numbers. And last but not least is the whole special education area. Actually, that's not last. I'm going to skip down there. Special education, it's the area that school board members say to us is the one that is the most difficult for them, because they often build the budget and then they get told, well, there's another couple $100,000 that relates to certain students, and we really can't get into it with you, and so it ends up being a simple number that gets added to the budget. We do urge board members not to get into the discussion of specific individual children, but to definitely pay attention to practices and how your practices, how your rate of identification compares with others, how your use of paraprofessionals compares with others. comparison of practice is definitely important. Going back up to continued decline in student-teacher ratio, I want to show you this because this is the other one that has become a big issue with legislators and a big driver of, you know, the concerns that you'll hear. You can see over that 10-year period, 2004 to 2013, the number of staff has basically been constant. There was a little rise 2008, 2009, dropped back down a little bit, but by and large, it has been pretty much unchanged. And during that period of time, we have lost 10 to 12% of our student body. So people talk about that, and of course what we say is what you all know, which is that the decisions to add staff when you're in a growth period are very different than the decisions when you're in a shrinking period. Going up, you're basically doing a mathematical calculation and deciding when you've hit that threshold where people say, yeah, we ought to add staff and reduce the number of second graders per class. But coming down the other way, the people you're talking about laying off have names, they have expertise. Family members are coming saying, don't do that to my second grader, etc. So boards have really have a large task, and there are people in the legislature that would like to put a squeeze on. There was discussion about whether there should be some kind of ratios, whether there should be some kind of penalties if you didn't fall within the ratio. That was where we as an association basically said, don't do that. If you want to do something, do the excess spending threshold, which keeps it at a very high level. But because everybody's situation is so different, there's no way that a legislator is going to make the best decision for a particular school district. I know that from talking with many people that this is something that many districts this year have wrestled with, agonized over, and it's a tough, tough discussion. But I wanted to just point that out to you, that this is probably the area that when legislators say, well, school boards spend too much money, oftentimes in the same breath we've got more adults now per student by far than we did 10 years ago. One last comment on money before we shift over, which is the business about when you're looking at tax policy, the question is, where does the money come from? And there has been erosion. You will see, hopefully you can see my little arrow going across here. In 2005, about 61% of all the money that went into the Ed Fund came from property taxes. 23.7% was the general fund transfer. Now if you go across to 2013, which is the year we're in now, we're at 67%, and the projection in fiscal 2015 is that 68% will come from the property tax and 19.5% from the general fund. So that erosion, which came in many different forms, but the biggest one was there was a $23 million reduction in 2011 from the general fund transfer, and there was a $4 million shift in expenses for the Community High School of Vermont that came into the education fund, and both of those impacted this ratio. So our part of the position that we've taken is that there needs to be attention to restore the percentage splits to something closer to what it was when Act 60 and 68 were passed, which looks more like this bar here. Any comments or questions about the money slide? Carrie, I'm not seeing the question pane here. Okay. Let's go. Okay, but if there's some, you'll put it back on there. Okay. All right. Okay. So last but not least, I'm going to go through a couple of other items that are pressing, and again, we would welcome your thoughts about them. Okay. There we go. All right, so theme 3 was has the very complex title of miscellaneous. And I'm going to go through these quickly. These 3 items came from our membership at various times over the last year. One is firearms near schools. There will be a bill. There is a bill that is, I think, labeled firearms near schools that's in Senate Education right now. They will be adding to what's there, which basically said kids shouldn't be able to bring firearms in the parking lots. This one would also, our proposal was that you should not be able to shoot firearms within 500 feet of a school district, and that grew from Shrewsbury, where there was an incident where there was someone shooting on a private shooting range next door to the school. The school went into lockdown. The police were called. Parents were notified. I mean, it was a traumatic experience for everybody. It was discovered that the shooting was taking place on a private range. There was nothing that could be done about it, but it was very close to the school. So they have asked that a bill be introduced that would put a restriction of 500 feet on shooting on personal property. Obviously, a sensitive issue. We'll see where it goes. The second one has to do with private schools serving a largely publicly funded population. We have the 4 traditional academies that serve lots of public school children. They meet most public school standards. They serve all students from many towns that use them as their primary high schools. They provide special education services. They provide free and reduced lunch. There is no problem at all with the 4 large academies. There are some small independent schools that largely function as a result of tuition students from the public system who have admissions criteria that are quite restricted and do not provide much in the way of services for any students with disabilities. And oftentimes they market themselves head-to-head against local public schools, basically pointing to their higher test scores, et cetera, when in fact they don't serve the same population. So there is a bill in Senate Education called S91, which basically says if you serve more than 30%, if more than 30% of your students are in general education through the public system, then you have to meet many of the requirements of a public school. So that's what that one is. And then last, there was this whole question of the privatization of public schools. That is going to continue to get debated. As far as we're concerned, a local board does have, under current law, the right to say, you know something, we've reached a point where we feel we need to close our public school and recommend to our town that they close their public school and tuition their students. But that is different than actually taking a public asset and converting it to a private institution that the board is invested in. So that issue, something is likely to happen relative to that issue. At least that issue will get debated again. Okay, questions or comments about any of those 3? There are countless other small things that will be coming up that you'll read about in our legislative reports.
At this point, we don't have any questions, Steve.
Okay. So at this point, I'm going to shift back over to Nicole.
Nicole, are you on with us?
Hello?
Okay, you're unmuted.
Here I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to spend just a couple minutes going through some resources that are available to you all as you think about how engaged you want to be this coming session relative to the public policy conversation that will unfold. Wait, let me see here. It's not advancing my slide. Okay. Here we go. Okay. All right, great. So the first thing that we do when committees are taking testimony on bills that are of particular interest to school board members, we help to organize testimony, arrange for you to appear in front of a committee. We can provide you with some talking points or information that will be helpful for you as you prepare your testimony. And can help follow in terms of follow-up after you provide the testimony, if you so choose. We could also just give you background information about the committee that you're going to be speaking with and all that. We've mentioned a couple times the legislative updates, which come by email from Steve or Carrie, that will provide you with more frequent information in the interim between the legislative reports that go out, roughly once a week. If there's information that needs to be shared with you all in the interim, that will come in an email from Steve. In addition to our legislative alerts, which really are designed to prompt board members to take action immediately when a bill is either being debated or up for a vote in a committee or up for a vote on the floor of either the House or the Senate. And it's really important that legislators hear in a very tight time frame from constituents. You'll receive a legislative alert from us. We also ourselves provide direct contact. I mean, we interact with legislators almost daily while they're in session on matters relative to bills that impact school board members, and are happy to place you all in direct contact with a legislator and even arrange a meeting so that you can build a relationship with your elected official if you don't already have one.
Nicole?
Yeah?
Yeah, just one thing to add to that. On the direct contact side, we welcome you calling us if you've got particular concerns about either a bill that you've been reading about and you want to know more about it and you're trying to sort it out. If you've got a strong opinion about something that VSBA has taken a position on and you want to raise questions about it, or if you've got a situation in your own district that is a particular bill is either affecting you in some very negative way, or if you need some kind of special treatment in a particular bill. We've had districts that were trying to do some pretty unique things, and they needed a tweak in a bill that would allow them to make it happen. We had two districts that entered into a merger. I think there's someone on the call here from Two Rivers, and there were two supervisory unions that wanted to come together and merge, but they only wanted to do it if there was sufficient support for that merger coming from the state. And so that effort got special treatment in the legislature, and we're glad to help people with particular problems. So feel free to call us.
Thanks, Steve. We also have the VSBA resolutions process, which our members vote on resolutions at our annual meeting in October, but we encourage boards to be thinking about resolutions that can be submitted to the committee for consideration so that we can, because the resolutions essentially shape our public policy positions relative to the General Assembly, but also relative to conversations we have with folks at the Agency of Education, other government agencies that impact education. So staying engaged in both understanding what resolutions we currently have and what resolutions you may want to put forward from your board to help guide the positions of the association is a really important avenue for you to communicate with us and influence public policy. So the VSBA serves as the collective voice of Vermont school boards, and we need to hear from you in order to be effective in that role. So it's important that you stay informed, read our reports, our newsletter, our email communications. Contact us with your concerns or information, analysis, insights you have about how a particular public policy is playing out in your district or may play out in your district, as Steve just alluded to, and initiate resolutions at the local level to really help us be in a position where we're driving education policy in the state of Vermont, not merely reacting or responding to what's being put out there. So I've referenced a couple times the Education and Legislative Report. You should have gotten your first issue on Friday. We are trying a new format of distributing that to board members using sort of our newsletter style, so that you just click on links of interest to you within the report. But it's been a publication that we've been putting out for several years now, so for those of you who've been around for a while, if you would just take a moment to rate the Education Legislative Report. And again, Carrie, I don't think we'll be able to see the poll results on my screen.
Right, the poll's up now. If everyone could please vote.
And Carrie's going to tell me what.
And we're almost done with the poll. Looks like we now have 100%. And it looks like 57% rate it as a 1, which is great. 29% rate it as a 2, and 14% rate it as a 3. There's nothing for 4 or 5, so that's great results.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. And as I mentioned, I'm responsible for putting that report together. So if you have any questions, comments, feedback, please send those to me directly. It's my hope to make it as informative as possible without being sort of overloading you with content. So the more feedback I have in terms of its usefulness, the better. So thank you very much for joining us. Steve, I don't know if you have any concluding comments you'd like to make, but please, as you exit, make sure you take a moment or two to complete the evaluation. I know we are ending a few minutes early. And look for the follow-up email from Carrie, which will include both the unedited webinar, the PowerPoint answers to any written questions, although I don't think we had too many that went unanswered. And that's that. Steve? Did you have anything else to say? No? All right. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Are you okay? I was talking without I was muted. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I was just saying that since we had a couple more minutes, if anybody had anything that they wanted to communicate to us, either things you were particularly interested in, concerned about, any new issue that you think that we've totally missed, you could feel free to either say it with a raised hand, or you could enter it into the question box, so that we'd at least have a heads up on that particular issue. Not seeing anybody who's dying to do that. I know this forum is not as fluid as many others, but again, we would urge you to feel free to contact us, you know, in the coming days as this legislative session unfolds and as you have other thoughts. So again, thank
Steve,
you very much for joining us.
Steve,
yes.
Jill was wondering if the PowerPoint presented is going to be on the VSBA website. You will all receive the PowerPoint by email. I'm not sure if it's going to be on the website.
No, the entire thing will not be on the website. We will edit down pieces that will go into prospective places on the website, but they will all receive via email a link to the complete unedited video from this, as well as the PowerPoint from this.
And we have a question from Jerome. Is there a bill that would restore the percentage of the general fund transfer?
There is not a bill. There is not a bill. It's a very good question, and the dilemma we have, just to put it bluntly, is that the governor came to the Vermont School Boards Association meeting in September, and we liked most of what he had to say. He was very supportive. He is a strong believer in local voice on local school boards and local ownership of education, and we really liked most of what he had to say. But when we raised this issue with him, he expressed that back 3 years ago when that money was taken out, that it was during the depths of the recession, and it was they took the money out, and at that same moment in time they accepted 20-something million, 23 million or whatever from the federal government, which was part of the connected to the stimulus effort. And there had been a debate about whether Governor Douglas was going to accept it or not, and this is just as Governor Shumlin was coming into office. So he was under the impression, he would tell you today if you were to come up to him and approach him about that subject, he would say there was a deal. Well, number one, I wasn't here, but number two, everybody who was here told me there was no deal. But in any case, so the governor is feeling like that at least 20 or 23 million of that was removed at that moment in time, with the expectation that at some point in time the federal money would be gone and we would be looking to try to reduce school spending by that amount given the continued decrease in the number of students. That's simply what you will be told. That's what I have been told. That's what our board was told when we raised it with the governor. But there's a lot of people in this conversation. The fact is the House Ways and Means Committee is looking at these issues. They saw the chart that we showed you a little while ago, but with the erosion in the percentage of the ed fund that's coming from places other than property taxes, they're going to have to deal with that issue, and we continue to raise it every time we provide testimony. But at the moment, there's not a particular bill, and the way that'll play itself out is in the budget process, depending on how much money gets budgeted for the ed fund.
So we have another comment from Paul Hatch. State-by-state comparisons always show Vermont in an unfavorable way. Is the social services required by Vermont schools at the same level in the states we're compared with?
Was that a question of whether we have the same requirements?
Whether we have, yeah, essentially, do we have more requirements in the area of social services than other states that we are often compared with in terms of spending and student performance, I imagine.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And at the end, bottom line is I don't know the answer to the question. I don't think we really know the answer. I think it's safe to say that we have a lot of social service type demands on our schools. I think most states have, and I shouldn't say most, certainly most states in the Northeast have, I think, similar kinds of expectations. We might be a little more than others, but I think our costs are driven in part by the small nature of our schools and by our very comparatively low student-teacher ratios, student-adult ratios. Our student-teacher ratio is about 11.6 to 1. Nationally, I think it's 14 or 15 to 1. So there are things that drive it, but I don't know as the social service side of things is the single biggest driver. We certainly are. We certainly have a very responsive special education structure, although I think there are many states that do, but not all. Some of the very low spending states, I think, really are pretty weak on a lot of fronts. But I think, of the higher spending states, I think we're all probably pretty much in the same ballpark.
Then we have a comment from Jill Faulkner. It seems it would be helpful to compare our tuition costs with graduation rates, et cetera.
Now, tuition, Jill, when you're referring to tuition costs, are Are you referring to our cost per student?
Or higher ed?
Or higher ed, yeah. Yes, cost per student. Yes, I mean, the fact is, I mean, it needs to be said, it can't be said enough, that according to most measures that are kept nationally, Vermont is in the top 1, 2, 3, or 4. I mean, we operate a more effective system than most states. We pay, we're generous with education. We're committed to education. Our communities are extremely supportive, and that's all a very positive story. And at the same time, we have to continue to, in our job as both the parties that are responsible for the well-being of children and assuring taxpayers are getting the best return, we have to continually ask ourselves the question, could we do as good a job slightly more efficiently? And if the answer to that is yes, then we need to keep working away at it. But I don't think anybody is advocating. I don't hear anybody advocating for us to be part of a race to the bottom. I don't hear anybody saying, yeah, let's have the highest student-teacher ratio, let's have the lowest spending. I hear people really wanting to focus on, are we giving our kids, for the money that we spend, are we giving our kids the best opportunity we possibly can? And with
all right,
that,
I don't see anything else.
Okay. I want to thank you all for spending your evening with us, and I wish you well and if you haven't already brought your budgets to conclusion, I know you will be in the next week or so, and we get asked a lot of questions about what's going on with the budget statewide, and we do our best to support the districts and their work and try to help educate the community about the various pressures that are out there. So keep up the good work. Thank you for your service to the children of the state and of your communities.
Thank you all. Have a good night.